one of the things that happens when you're around someone who is sick or someone who is suffering, we don't know how to suffer very well. That's definitely not something that our culture teaches us to do. And so what happens when you're the one suffering is people, very well-meaning, will try to wrap it up in a nice little bow. And there's a couple of things that happen. One is, it's going to be okay. Be positive. Being positive is great, but it does not mean that things are going to work out as you might want them to. The other thing that happens is people try to help assign meaning to things, or they ask you questions, again, well-meaning, what's the significance of having gone through all this stuff? And if I'm honest, our experience has been, I don't know.
This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. Matt Wilks is a physical therapist by trade, who today serves as VP and Chief Rehabilitation Officer for Sheltering Arms Institute, a cutting-edge inpatient rehabilitation hospital in Richmond, Virginia. Matt and I met in college many moons ago, and we've reconnected in the past several years through a mutual friend. The story Matt shares in this episode is a first-hand report from the front lines of 7 years of suffering. He invites us into some of the darkest moments, including his own dark night of the soul, the triumphant moments, and much more in between. Matt's story is, of course, uniquely his. In a way, though, his story is also our story, the story of humans sharing the same blue marble of a planet for a brief span of time in the vast overall timeline of humanity, with all of its painful lows and thrilling highs. And in Matt's modern-day story, we find ancient wisdom for living our most fulfilling and meaningful lives as humans on planet Earth. All right, let's get to it.
In the beginning, suffering to me felt like it was unique and special. And what I have learned is that it is unique. It's me. I'm the only me. I'm, experiencing the hardness of life when things are hard. But it's really not special in the sense that this is not a new issue. I'm not the first man who has. Mostly what I've done is I've watched my family suffer, right? And that's a particular kind of suffering. I've had ways in which over the last number of years that I also have suffered, but primarily my bit of suffering has been to watch others that I love suffer. But it's not special in the sense that we have the market cornered on suffering, or there are certainly many, many people who we've met, had close contact with, who would gladly trade places with me and my family. And so we're always mindful of that.
Yeah, it's a club you don't really care to belong to, but when you begin suffering, I would imagine you begin to bump into others who are suffering as well, and find, I don't know what you find when you bump into those people, because like I said, it's an unwanted, and you don't ask to enter this club. I appreciate that point about it's unique in that it's happening to you, and there's only one you, but it's not special. And of course, one of the reasons this podcast exists is because, we in America and those listening in the quote developed Western world are often more insulated from the kinds of suffering that much of the rest of the world experiences. And the double-edged sword of that, of course, is that we can be lulled into a sense that, this pleasant, convenient life that I'm living will just continue and things will be hunky-dory for a while. And then, of course, when crisis comes knocking and we wake up to the fact that that's not true, sometimes there's so much water under the bridge, it's too little too late, and we've built up this account of regrets, this balance in our account that we can't undo any longer, and we're unable to go back and remedy that. And our life has been half-lived. It is my conviction that many of us live lives somewhat in the shadows, as one of my other podcast guests talked about, John O'Bell's, how a number of things in his life had caused him to come out of the shadows and really begin to live into what he believed was his true self. And I think there's few things more powerful and more beautiful than someone really being who they were made to be. And that's why we're here today. And I want to get kicked off by just asking you in as concise a fashion as you can, because it's a remarkable timeline, set the stage for us in terms of what your family has experienced over the past 6.5+ years. What happened when, to whom, And then on the tail end of that, let us know how everybody's doing so that as we walk through this timeline, we can know what state you guys are in now.
Sure. So about 7 years ago was our first introduction to the hardness of life. My wife, Amy Caroline, she's 2 years older than I am. We met in college. I've been married almost 25 years now. Love of my life. And
real quickly, you guys can't see Matt, but I can see Matt because we're using a video application as well. And when he said love of my life, the side of his mouth kind of flicked up a little bit and he got really bright when he said that. So Amy Caroline, that's for you to know that when he said your name, he lit up and it was a genuine thing. It's so cool, man, to be able to say that. And 25 years of marriage, dude, you are old. You're getting really long in the tooth.
Right. That's why I am old and also lucky, so we got married on the young side for our friend set, and it's been great. We've just had a lot of great years together. We've also experienced a lot of junk together as well, which I think is part of the beauty of marriage, that we're tied together for better or worse, and sickness and health. And so that it's great to actually replay some of those vows as we've moved along. So back to the story. So about 7 years ago, she was diagnosed with melanoma. She had a small spot on her back. She looked at me one morning and said, "Hey, what is this thing?" I said, actually, I think you need to have that looked at. You need to get it looked at right away. So the dermatologist saw it, diagnosed it as melanoma, and then the biopsy surgery, the lymph node biopsy, they had to remove lots of skin, that sort of thing. And we waited for a couple of weeks to get the results of, had it gone deeper than the skin? Is it in the lymph nodes? And if so, then the prognosis is, at that point in time, there are other treatments nowadays, but at that point in time, it would have been very difficult to treat and very scary. So I was faced with the possibility of, am I going to lose my wife so soon in life? Then a number of years later, our son was diagnosed. He was 8 at the time. Playing soccer, normal kid, good little athlete, very active. He came off a soccer field one evening as we were picking him up, crying and complaining of pain in his shin. And we thought, well, did you fall down? Did you get kicked? You're playing soccer, of course. No, it's been hurting. It hurts. That quickly turned into, he didn't get kicked. There wasn't something that could explain this pain. A couple of quick doctor's visits later. I actually think that Amy Caroline saved Hayes' life by taking him to a pediatric orthopedic surgeon so quickly. So we kind of didn't mess around with the typical medical chain of maybe see a pediatrician, wait a while, see if it improves, that sort of trajectory. So got fast-tracked, and I can recall things went from his leg hurts to he may have a tumor in his bone. I had absolutely no knowledge about what that would mean. The differential diagnosis is either it's going to be a rare infection or it's going to be bone cancer. It turned out to be bone cancer.
And you went from him coming off the soccer field and saying his shin hurts to it's bone cancer over what span of time?
A week.
Holy smoke.
Yeah. So during that time period, we were quickly educating ourselves once we got the diagnosis. And there's a whole story around what that felt like, to hear the diagnosis. But I don't think the gravity and the reality of it dawned on us. So real quickly, what bone cancer for an 8-year-old means is you just won the anti-lottery. It's extremely rare. It's like 1 in a million chance that an 8-year-old gets bone cancer. You instantly start to ask, the questions that, no parent wants to ask, but what are the things that we need to do, and how likely is it that my kid's going to survive? And it's about a 60% chance that your child will survive out to 5 years. And what I didn't know at the time, that sounds better than many cancers, right? So there's about a 60% chance that your child's going to make it. That sounds great. But then as you dig into those studies upon which the survival odds are based, about half of those kids who make it to the 5-year mark are dying. So you really have, there's about a 30%.
They're just getting over that line. They're thriving beyond that. They're just making it there. Yeah.
That's right. They've sort of been sick the whole time, but they've managed to endure treatments long enough to make it to 5 years. So extremely difficult. The other thing that happens with bone cancer is you have to make decisions about, do you amputate a leg? His tumor, his primary tumor, was in his shin bone, his tibia, just below his knee on the right side. So you have to make a decision about, do we amputate the leg, or are there other treatments that might be available?
And that was instantly sort of the fork in the road.
Instantly.
As soon as you get this diagnosis, the doctor's saying, hey, look, some decisions to make.
Yeah. We
go maybe an aggressive treatment route, and or we take that part of the leg. Those are the decisions you're facing a week after his shin hurts.
Yeah. So as soon as the diagnosis is made by biopsy, they're scheduling a port placement. So his second surgery is to put in an indwelling catheter that essentially is the chemotherapy delivery mechanism, and it goes right into one of the major arteries in the neck. So you schedule that port placement, and then they start talking to you about the chemotherapy options that are available. You have a little bit of time before you have to make a surgical decision to amputate or not to amputate, because you have to get enough chemotherapy on board to try to shrink and stop the tumor growth before you can entertain surgery. So.
And that was his second of now how many surgeries all told has Hayes had?
Oh, you sent me that in some of the prep questions. I've lost count. It's probably near 100.
Unbelievable. Okay.
The most succinct timeline is from biopsy, then you start chemotherapy. You then have a number of months later, usually about 2 or 3 months later, you have to have a definitive surgery if it's possible to remove the whole tumor. And thankfully for Hayes, it was. We interviewed surgeons kind of along the East Coast and met a guy, Dan Prince, at Memorial Sloan Kettering in Manhattan, where we actually ran into Brian Barry, your brother-in-law. And I've got stories of how generous Brian and Holly were.
That's right. Y'all's stories intersected up there. So what Matt's referring to is my brother-in-law was in the midst of a cancer battle in this same time frame, and my sister and you got in touch at some point, right? Was it at Sloan Kettering or before you went to Sloan Kettering, or?
We had been in touch before, and they happened to be up at the same time that Hayes was having one of his surgeries.
Yeah.
Let me just tell you something about your brother-in-law that I don't know if you know this story, but and this is true of many people that we've met. The generosity, I get just such this well of emotion when I think about what they did for us that night. So he's up there for a checkup, and he's trying to figure out, what treatments are available and how is treatment going. Things are incredibly stressful. And at that time, I think he had a portion of his femur removed, or he was on crutches and clearly in a lot of pain. He and Holly schlepped all the way across to Midtown Manhattan, where we were staying in an apartment that was, generously made available by some stranger for us. And I remember they came over to encourage us and to pray with us before Hayes's next big surgery at MSK. And I remember having gin and tonic with Holly. In some way, that solidarity was so encouraging to us, just to know that we weren't alone. And I think encouraging them as well, because they had a purpose. Their suffering had a purpose. So.
Thanks for reconnecting those dots. That was in the midst of some of Brian's most intense early stages of his ordeal. And yeah, did he have the same surgeon? Was Dan Prince the same surgeon? Do you know?
No, I don't. I'm pretty sure he was not. I think Dan does. He does like some specialty bone procedures, but only for kids typically.
Yeah. And Brian's surgeon had just completely re-engineered everything from his hip down, having taken the cancer out and tried to make still there be some semblance of a functioning limb in there. And that was early in that battle. And thanks for reconnecting those dots for me, because I had forgotten that part where those stories intersected. And for those of you listening, I tell some of that story in one of the early episodes of this podcast. Don't remember the number. It might have been number 1 or number 3 or something. You can check it out. But Brian's story was instrumental in helping me to kind of get back on a life-affirming track in my own life and realize the power of mortality to motivate us. So I can connect all the dots again. Keep going with your timeline. This is killing me because every part of this timeline has so many questions to be asked that I just want to dig in at every point. But let's finish the timeline, and then we'll dig into other stuff.
So we went up to MSK. Hayes had his definitive surgery to remove the tumor, and then we continue with chemotherapy for about another 6 to 9 months. Hayes also has had an experimental, is a whole crazy story, being able to get an experimental drug from Europe imported, special permission from the FDA to not seize the medication at the border, special physician who was willing to essentially say, according to their license, they were willing to give the drug, a pharmacy that was willing to reconstitute the drug.
So what you're telling me is you're involved in an elaborate drug smuggling operation? Is that sort of what you're saying?
We are officially drug smugglers.
Okay, cool. I've never known one.
Here's the ridiculous part. Here's how much I love my kid. The cost of that drug was $300,000. And at the time that they made it available to us, they told me the cost to import the drug, and I said, do it.
Wow.
Didn't even think about it. Through some remarkable providence, we ended up not having to pay very much for that drug at all, like a small fraction of that cost.
Awesome.
So Hayes had really innumerable treatments for about the first 2 to 2.5 years from when he was diagnosed. So many of those were orthopedic surgeries. He had numerous infections because the surgery that we elected for him to have saved his limb. So he has 2 legs, which is super wonderful. He looks a little bit like Nemo. He's got like a lucky flipper. So his leg is shorter, his foot is smaller. But he can walk, and he's got 2 legs, which is, Dan Prince is just a miracle worker. I mean, it's unbelievable. So during that time, it would have been rare for us to have more than a handful of days where we did not have to make a major medical decision or have to be in an ER or in a surgical procedure or something like that.
And I would imagine at each of those moments, you're thinking, did we make the right choice? Was this the right call? What's going to come on the heels of this?
Yeah.
I can't imagine living week after week like that.
In fact, I
cannot imagine.
Yeah, orthopedically, we sort of learned to separate like oncology from orthopedics, but orthopedically, we had another orthopedic surgeon, the same surgeon who did the biopsy here in town, say to us, he was looking at an X-ray. There was a time where there was a screw that was falling out of Hayes's bone. It was poking out through his skin, so the surgeon here had to help with that. And he said, he's looking at an X-ray and he's showing me the X-ray. He's like, I don't know what Dan Prince's plan is. This is not going to work out. And we've invested, time and money and, just the anxiety of going through all those treatments, poor Hayes going through all those treatments. To hear that was quite deflating. Thankfully, it has worked out.
I'm going to break my own rule and jump in with another question here, but that's going to interrupt the timeline. And
all right, that's your fault. It's on you, man.
It is my fault. But I'm so curious to know, how is Hayes doing mentally and emotionally? He's gotten this diagnosis, and the next thing he knows, something's wrong with me. My parents are obviously distraught. They're making critical decisions. I'm going up to a big old hospital in New York City, and they're doing stuff to me. What is your observation of how he was doing? How is he processing this? This is an 8-year-old kid who was not a week earlier. The last thing on his mind was confronting a life and death issue.
I cannot do this justice with words. It was so very difficult to watch him suffer and to have to often cajole him into a horrific treatment. One of the definitive surgeries that he had, his surgeon took a picture during the operation. So I'm a physical therapist, and I'm interested in, I want to know where these muscles going to be reattached. You're removing the entire bone from his leg, and you're going to regrow, his entire tibia essentially. How are you doing that? What's going to happen? So he takes this picture, and it's just a flayed open red leg without a bone. And Hayes afterwards I still have PTSD.
This is a picture of Hayes' legs.
This is a picture of Hayes' leg, which was actually really helpful because I could see how catastrophic it was inside his body, what he had to tolerate. So for him, after that surgery alone, he just had uncontrollable pain, could not get the pain under control. And he would sleep in our room and wake up in the middle of the night screaming. I still, to this day, if there's any noise that sounds at all like some sort of high pitch, something at night, I'm instantly up. My adrenaline is pumping. And instantly flashback. I had no idea what PTSD was before that, right? The impact on Hayes was really, really hard to watch. His primary coping mechanism was to withdraw inside himself, which is very scary as a parent. For him not to talk, not smile, no sense of humor. The chemotherapy treatments are debilitating. In fact, there was a time I can recall vividly in a different New York apartment. We had to shower him before his next surgery. He's bald at the time. He probably should weigh something like 80 pounds, and he weighs about 45. Just skeletal. And my wife and I are helping him into the tub to scrub him down with this antiseptic rinse. And I just turned and I looked at Amy Caroline, as if to say, what are we doing? This is horrible. He's dying, right? And she looked back at me, and we just didn't have to say anything. We were like, well, what else can we do? We're doing the best we can for our kid. And it's, yes, this is horrible. And we had to convince him continually, we just have to keep going. We just have to keep going. So to get back to the timeline a bit, he goes through those treatments for about 2.5 years, very intensive time. Somewhere toward the end of that, my body started really shutting down. I still don't really know. There's a couple of possible medical explanations for that. I'm sure stress played a very big role in that. Viral something, B12 deficiency, which everybody should get their B12 level checked. That's important.
Okay, noted. And you are a medical professional, so that's advice that we might want to take seriously.
Yeah, I could hardly walk, which was pretty disconcerting, as you might imagine. Would go to work during the day, try to expend as little energy as possible, and barely be able to walk up my stairs. My muscles just hurt so badly, and they would twitch that I would only have enough energy to get to my bedroom floor and to lay on my face for about a half an hour when I got home, and just feel such a sense of accomplishment that I had gotten to that point in my day. I had endured, and I had gotten to that point. And then right after my rest, I would have to remind myself, I need to get up. I need to keep going, even if it's a walk 100 yards, maybe less, to the end of my small little street, just to keep my body moving.
The PT in you was coaching yourself along.
I was coaching myself along. Exactly right. And I could hardly walk to the end of my street in a straight line. I was wobbly. They started working me up for ALS. My muscles still twitch. Not quite as badly, but it's like they're fibrillations, right? And there's only two reasons that happens. One is ALS, which I won't go into. It's for anyone dealing with ALS. I feel a sense of empathy for folks that may have to deal with ALS. It's a terminal neurologic condition. The other reason is unexplained benign paroxysmal fasciculation. And that's apparently what I have, which thank God. That's what I have. Amy Caroline then was diagnosed with a second skin cancer diagnosis, melanoma. Again, it's the scariest of the 4 skin cancer types. I continued not to feel well, but it improved a bit. Amy Caroline was diagnosed shortly after that with a thankfully benign thyroid tumor about the size of a golf ball, which was it was pretty gross when they took it out. We have a picture of that. So it's on my phone, just for party tricks or whatever.
Your family photo album is a little different than others' family might be, huh?
That's hilarious, right? Yeah. And then most recently, I guess not most recently, actually, unfortunately, but Amy Caroline relatively recently was diagnosed with breast cancer. Had to go through a couple of surgeries. There's a hilarious story of our family. We thought everything medical was behind us. Our family was on vacation in Europe. She had just had, surgery to remove the breast cancer. The incision seemed like it was healed, and all of a sudden we're on vacation in the middle of the Czech Republic, and the incision opens up and starts draining in the middle of the Czech Republic. And what the heck do you do with that? So another surgery after that, and radiation. She's thankfully doing very well now. And then we've also had two family members. My dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's a couple of years ago when he was 70, and more recently, one of Amy Caroline's family members as well. So really hard, really hard stuff.
Well, and the family member you mentioned to me, Amy Caroline's other family member that was diagnosed is really early onset of Alzheimer's, right, at 54.
Yeah.
So if you're anything like me, listeners out there, you are shaking your head and wondering how all of these things happen to one man, to one family. And of course, I have no idea. None of us understand why this would be the case. And in my very naive, inexperienced opinion, that why question very quickly becomes quicksand and an unuseful path to tread, simply because how do you make sense of that? I don't know that you do make sense of that. Thanks for bearing with me and asking you to try and ram us through that timeline, because there's so much there. And each one of those episodes is a podcast episode in and of itself, just to understand what your experience was like. And there are so many moving parts in this story too, because Matt, there's your perspective on what you're experiencing. And as you said earlier, much of your suffering has been of that of the observer who cares for and loves these people deeply, and what you want most is for them to still be with you, and to know that you have to make decisions on their behalf to help them have the best chance at continuing in life as long as they can. But not every decision you make is a sure thing. Most of them, it sounds like, were not sure things. It's like, well, we could do this or we could do this, and this one may have a little bit of outcome, it may not. And so a lot of your suffering was that of the observer, but you had your own physical suffering. And then there's Amy Caroline's story, having had 3 bouts of a malignant form of cancer, 1 bout of, I guess I'm not a medical professional, but a benign form of cancer. It was still a cancerous thing, I guess, but benign, is that right?
Yeah, that's accurate.
And there's her story that we could unpack. And then you have 2 other kids. You've got a daughter who's 19 now and a daughter who's 16. They're part of this story too. They're part of this ecosystem. They're watching their family encounter mortality over what has been now a 7-year period, and not just one person. I mean, like you're used to hearing stories about one family member who's suffering through something and the whole family rallies around them. But, Amy Caroline takes the hit first with the first round bout of melanoma. Then Hayes gets this horrible diagnosis with all of the treatment and the suffering that went along with it. You get your thing, which, like in my brain, to not know what was happening to you and to still kind of not know what was going on would be another form of suffering. So will it come back? What was that about? Is it sleeping? Was it just stress? Then Amy Caroline has a couple more bouts of cancer. So you've got this whole ecosystem of suffering in different forms in different ways. It's just
an ecosystem of suffering. Yeah.
Ecosystem of suffering is such a weird way to say it, but that's the only way I can think of it right now, because all of you are inextricably related to one another in bonds of love, bonds of blood, bonds of DNA, and everyone was suffering in their own way. And of course, you can speak best to your own perspective on the situation. And that's really what we're here to capture today. And maybe there's other conversations to be had with Amy Caroline and your daughters and Hayes, if he's ever willing, to talk about this, because to hear what a now 13-year-old Hayes would say about the ordeal he's been through would be pretty remarkable, because undoubtedly he's a very different 13-year-old than he would have been had this not happened. Which reminds me, we're saying Hayes in the present tense because Hayes is still with us.
He is.
How is he doing?
He is doing. He's doing very well. We still can't help ourselves. We worry about how things will ultimately turn out for him. There's the fear of a relapse is never far away. And so just real quickly, what that means for a kid who has had bone cancer is, if it does come back, the survival odds are really pretty poor. And it can come back in 2 ways. The most common way is that it would come back as metastatic cancer in the lungs. If it were to come back in the bones directly, that's really the worst case scenario. But in either case, the survival odds go way down. So you're always sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop. The surveillance scanning that is done more frequently in the beginning. He's spaced out now to every 6 months, and he actually only has one more scan to go before he's statistically, for whatever that's worth, he's a sample size of one, so the statistics are ridiculous. But statistically, his odds of having a relapse are virtually extinguished at the 5 year from when he finished his last treatment. So that'll be about December of this year. So we're actually coming up on that.
That is a big deal.
We'll be, as with every scan, it's like your team is playing in the Super Bowl and they can only lose, right? So if they win, you're like not really excited at all because you know there's another thing there's another game you have to play, or whatever the silly analogy is. So we're always worried about what those results will be. But right now he's doing great.
What are your observations about like how he's doing as a young man, in his heart and his mind, having been through this trauma, prolonged trauma, physical, mental, emotional?
That's an interesting question. There are several things that I resolved to do or not to do as his whole story was unfolding. One of the things was my expectation is that God is going to do something cool with this. And I remember thinking that from jump. Right when he was diagnosed, we had a group of people that came over to the house, and through tears, most of them mine and Amy Caroline's, prayed for us, prayed with Hayes in our living room. So meaningful to know that we were going to suffer, but we were not going to suffer alone. So meaningful. And I remember having a conversation in my little foyer about I can't undo this. There's instantly what happens, like something like this goes down in life, and there's some sort of bargain making. Like you can kind of call it what you want, or like think about it slightly differently. But I'm trying to trade God. Just give this to me. Don't do this to my kid, right? I can't clearly make that trade. It's completely irrational. But I would do that in a heartbeat. But I remember thinking at that moment, I want to see what God is going to do with this. And so I would not undo it. The only thing that I cannot reconcile is when you watch it happen to someone that you love, I can't reconcile that suffering. That's still in my mind. It's a very difficult thing to say, I would not undo this. I do trust you, God, that you are in some mysterious way bringing yourself glory and doing this for our good, for his good. And at the same time, I'm a fragile human being, and it's really pretty awful to watch your kid suffer in this way. And he suffered quite a lot. I remember also thinking, I don't have any claim on what God might do with this. So while I expect that he will do something with it, I don't have a claim on how this will happen. And one of those things, Amy Caroline, I've talked about this quite a bit. We hope that God would make Hayes like this neat man that has like a deep faith, understands how other people suffer, could be an encouragement to others. Like I have some mental framework of what I hope this would work itself out to be in his life. It may be that, it may be a piece of that, it may be that, not at all. And that's Hayes' story. That's how it belongs specifically to him. My sense is that he has had many experiences that others his age have not had. He has a different experience growing up. He's had people make fun of his leg. He's felt different when he was bald. He's gone from a little star athlete to not being able to play at all, to being able to play a little bit. He has to wear a funny looking shoe. Like all of those things are atypical for most kids. So I think there's a depth to him in the suffering. The other thing that's really important to note is that this has become part of the story of our whole family. So you mentioned, the girls. There's a whole year where I don't even know where the girls were. I'm embarrassed to say. I knew they were taken care of. We had friends that were pitching in to take care of, but I would go to work, to the hospital, to work, to the hospital. Amy Caroline and I would sort of rotate, and I would maybe see the girls every 3 days in between something. I don't know who their teachers were. I routinely lose track of what grade they're in because there's a year for me that's missing. So there was a real cost for the girls as well. But we look at that as this is our family's story, and we all suffered together. And there was legit terrible dark times. If it's of interest, I mean, I've had a personal dark night of the soul. It's awful. And there was such deep beauty in some things and so unexpected. You just can't draw this stuff up. I mean, things that would
Like what? Can you tell us more? Like what? And when you say dark night of the soul, that, it's a phrase that many of us have run across before. What flavor was yours? What does that mean to you when you say that?
Yeah, so there's kind of two questions in there. So one is the dark night of the soul. The other is, let me just tell you a quick story about how unexpected beauty shows up. One really vivid example is Hayes and I, we would have to fly up to New York. We had this elaborate, actually simplified over time, but elaborate way of getting to New York. So there were pilots who would donate their plane and their time, and they would fly us up from a little regional airport up to an airport in New York, and then drive us into the city. It's like super fantastic, particularly
again, an unwanted club. Like, I don't want to be in this club, but if I got to be in this club, I might as well be a VIP in a private plane.
That was awesome. It was fantastic, yeah. Right? So we're traveling up there, and we think we're just going for a garden variety checkup to check on some ridiculous hardware that he has in his leg at the time. And when the surgeon sees him, he looks at this and X-rays and MRI, and then says, "Well, we actually need to get you down to the OR like right away." And so we need to get you down there. Hayes falls to bits and is just inconsolable, screaming, writhing. I have him on an exam table, and I'm just trying to hold him so that he doesn't hurt himself for probably, time is all relative in a moment like that. It's a long time. It's probably a half an hour. And the office staff is just kind of like giving us space to like go through our thing. Then at the end of that, about a half an hour, they come in and say, "You know what we just did? We got his labs back, and his platelet count is so low, we really can't operate safely, so we cannot operate today." Terrible news also, that he needs a surgery, can't get it, but he's not well enough to tolerate the surgery, so we don't have any choice. We have to hit the abort button. Well, for Hayes, that's a reprieve, right? For me, I'm like, oh, great, this is another thing that we're have to put off, and it's something that's necessary. But for Hayes, he felt so liberated that we don't have to do that. And we end up going from complete meltdown, really dark time for Hayes, to, well, what are we going to do? We now have a free afternoon. So we end up in Central Park Zoo, just having an unbelievable like father-son bonding time. So I find myself in the middle of Central Park, and Hayes and I think we're sharing like a plate of French fries. He wouldn't eat very much back then. So we're sharing a plate of French fries. And I'm just looking at him, and I say to him, "Buddy, this is so great to be here with you. And I know this is really hard why we're here, but can you think of why else would you and I be in Central Park having a great day at the zoo?" Right? And so it became our tradition every time we would go up to the city that we would find something fun to do, to get into in the midst of what was hard. And so we consequently had some really fun, unexpected time that we otherwise would not have had. We just would have been going about a normal day. He would have been at school, I would have been working, seeing each other on the weekends or in the evenings, but just super special time. So
that is beautiful, and I think only people that have experienced things like what you've experienced can appreciate that those sweet, precious, truly joyful moments are existing right alongside a desperate struggle for your son's life. That those two things could exist in the same time and space, and be genuinely true, each of them. They're not bleeding over into the other. You were genuinely glad to be there with your son and genuinely happy in that moment with him, even as you'd gotten news that he wasn't healthy enough to have a surgery he desperately needed to continue to live. I mean, that blows my mind, but it is, in fact, a picture of life, isn't it?
One of the important truths for me has become the secret of contentment. And I do not know how to do this well, so I don't pretend to know how to do that. But I have come to know that there is real power in receiving a moment as it comes to you without having a claim on this is better or worse than I deserve. And just to receive it, I think the way that my heart works that out is it's not enough. We talked some about this before. It's not enough just to know that you're going to die, or to know that eventually Hayes will die, or all the people we love will die. We're all mortal. It is, for me, it really begs the question of who am I, who made me, and what is this all about, right? So the framework of in the suffering, there is beauty. I think that's a tip off to us that there's more behind the author of all of these things that we see. The maker of all things gives us good moments to encourage our souls and to express, his affection for us, and gives us hard moments to remind us in part that this is not our home, that this is not meant to last. So that contentment as a family, as we've endured more, that has in part worked itself out to contentment. And do we do it perfectly? Certainly not. We are, pretty normal family, and, get too attached to, the world and comfort and those sorts of things. But that contentment, I think there's something really valuable there. And it really comes when you have a sense of the analogy of sailing, right? You had a great, vignette podcast about sailing and having courage to go on a beam run and tolerate the chop and, not shy away from that. I think that works best when you realize that there's love beneath the waves, right? If you don't have a sense of who made the waves, and that there's a security that goes beyond the situation, then it would tempt you to not take risks or perhaps become bitter in suffering. And I think we've certainly experienced some of all of that, but realizing that there's love beneath the waves has been really key.
And just to connect the dots between the metaphor you're sharing there, love beneath the waves, and sort of the bottom line meaning, this is coincidental or providential or whatever word you want to use, that this episode is airing on the heels of an episode that came out will have come out about a month earlier than this one, with our local coroner here in Steamboat Springs in Routt County. And he shared the very same questions you just shared around life, where we come from, what are we here for, and what's next. And he comes at it from a Christian perspective as well, just like you do, and I do as well. And to the listeners, again, like I said in the episode with Rob Rigg, our local coroner, it's not my intent, nor Matt's intent, to persuade you to a certain way of seeing things, even though we believe in the way that we see these things, but rather to offer, in Matt's case, his perspective on life and the universe and the world and meaning and all those kinds of things. Because when we're able to hear someone else's perspective and how they navigate the world and interpret the world and create meaning, it can prompt us to question our own assumptions, our own reasons for believing certain things or failing to think about other things. And so on this podcast, I bring guests of all flavors and all persuasions, with the express purpose of helping each of us to wake up and live the lives we were made to live, become the people that we are uniquely made to be. And I hope that you benefit from all these different perspectives. It just so happens we've got 2 interview episodes in a row where you're getting a heaping dose of the Christian perspective. And I'm going to trust that there's some purpose behind that, because like Matt, I have a persuasion and a conviction that there is love beneath the waves of life, that there is an author underneath this storyline that each of us share together, and that each of us has a unique part in to play. So I'll leave it at that and just say, hey, I don't make any apologies about bringing this stuff out here, because I know that you're going to all do with it as you see fit, and you have your own decisions to make. And I'm glad to have people on this show that also don't share any of these perspectives, and will bring a very different one so that we can enrich each other. That idea of love beneath the waves just is super powerful for me. And you said that one of the things it does for you is you acknowledge that there's love beneath the waves, is it enables you to live with risk and boldness, a level of risk and a level of boldness. And on the podcast, I talk about living with guts, gusto, and abandon. And that's sort of what I'm connecting, is that when you're riding on the surface of the water and it's choppy and unpredictable, and the boat is challenged to stay on the waves and to stay afloat, then you're emboldened to live with more guts, gusto, and abandon. Because even if I sink, even if my ship fails, I know what's beneath me. How is this working out for you and your ecosystem that you have now? How many of you are embracing that? What does it look like? And let's keep shooting for these, how do we, who haven't and hopefully won't experience what you and your family have experienced, what do we begin to glean? I made you stop talking before we got on the podcast, before I hit record, because you kept dropping all these nuggets of gold. And this is some of the gold that you were dropping that I want to make sure we capture for our listeners. So There were like 7 different questions in there, and I apologize. You just talk about what is coming up for you.
I think it has become part of the fabric of our family. There's certainly a somewhat unwelcome depth to all of our relationships with one another. And I say unwelcome in that I would never want to, oh boy, I'm afraid to say this. I would never want to endure that. One of the things that dawned on us as we were dealing with Hayes has like far and away, like that episode in our lives has colored everything. We talk about it as like the before and the after, right? And we're living in the after. The suffering there, I would not want to endure a second of any of that suffering, nor would I want anyone else to have to endure any of that suffering. And yet we didn't choose it. We could not unchoose it. And we also had to realize that this was not going to be the last time, in all likelihood, that we would suffer in life. It would not be the last time. He's so young. When you're 8 and you have cancer like that and you deal with it for 5-6 years, he's still a young man. He's still going to suffer plenty of loss. And certainly, I pray almost every day, that the Lord would be pleased for Hayes to continue to be healthy, that the cancer would never come back. But I also know that he doesn't get a free pass just because he was 8 and had something tragic happen to him. Like there's going to be other things in his life in all likelihood. So when I think about, I'm conditioned to love comfort just as much as the next guy. But as I've thought about the fact that life is unmanageable, completely unmanageable, completely beyond my control. And I say that knowing that there's a mystery there. The actions I take are significant and relevant. But like the core underlying things of life, I don't have control over. I cannot stop time. I cannot stop the fact that I'm moving toward the grave. I cannot protect the people that I love in the fundamental ways that I would like to. So with that, this mingling of suffering and beauty is it's always there. It's always before us. And so acknowledging that as a family, I think has been really helpful. One of the habits that I got into during the time that we spent a lot of time in the hospital with Hayes, and I was realizing that I need beauty in life or I'm going to come unhinged, and I can talk about sort of coming unhinged in a second. But I made a point of trying to purposefully introduce beauty into my life. So that's one of the things that being mortal tells me, is that I need to remind myself of what is beautiful and which is essentially a testimony to the home, toward which I'm headed. So I developed a little spot in my backyard. I have a hammock strung up between a couple of really pretty trees. It's like dappled sunlight that comes in. There's a nice breeze that blows through that part of the yard. I have a little stand for a nice little cocktail and some snacks. My family makes fun of me because they know when I'm in the hammock, like it's hands off dad, and Matt. It's hammock time, so we have like sort of a running joke. And I got into the habit of reading, just lots of reading. In the really raw days, I needed to know what's truth. And one of the things that's fundamental to being human is we forget stuff, which is why we write stuff down. And the acknowledgement that this is not a it's unique to me, right? Like we talked about, it's not special. I'm not the first man who's dealt with this. So I looked to what are some ancient things that are written down about how people suffered. And so a lot of the Old Testament wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes in particular, my family probably several times this week already has made fun of me. I am a huge proponent of the book of Ecclesiastes. I think it should be required reading for humanity. It is no holds barred, no punches pulled. Life is going to be hard. You are young and you have wonderful things to grasp onto when you're young. Don't get too attached to them. They will all be stripped away as you get older, if you get older, and finally you will leave all your stuff to someone else. It's all chasing after the wind, right? And there are these beautiful nuggets in Ecclesiastes that remind us that we should see these beautiful things that we've been given, even like the eat, drink, and be merry. That sentiment comes from a verse in Ecclesiastes that was given to us for our joy, right? That's part of what we should do with our time, because we don't know how long we have. I've become a collector of moments. All these moments that we have, just being able to, look at you and talk to you today. What a pleasure to interact with me, just be made that way, to have the sensory organs to be able to see and hear and all those things that would just be so tempting to take for granted. That is such a gift and a blessing. So soak that good stuff up. And then when the dark times do come, and they will come, there's a recollection of all the ways that God has been good, not just to me, but in ancient ways to his people. There's so many stories. And so that's like the perfect segue to my experience with the dark night of the soul. There was a time, if Amy Caroline listens to this, I don't know if she knows this whole story or not, but there was, sorry, this is going to be a little hard for me to tell probably. There were about 4 or 5 times. I'm glad that my memory is starting to fade on these a little bit. They've are like burned so vividly into my consciousness, where we thought Hayes' cancer had come back. So there was a time that a screw was falling out of his leg, but it looked like the initial tumor growth. It was like red and kind of poking out. And there are other times, so the details aren't important, but one of these times, Hayes woke up crying out. I went into his room and I looked at him and did my PT thing, sort of assessed his leg and saw what was going on. And I thought, in all likelihood, this is the cancer coming back. Amy Caroline was still asleep. I was able to console Hayes. He falls back asleep, and I walk back to the bed, and I'm just at my end. I'm very tired. I realize afresh, I can't help my kid. The fear and the anxiety of like, this may very well be the cascade that kind of kicks off, losing my son. And I'm in the bed, and there's for anybody that's ever dealt with cancer, you have my deepest sympathies. There's this mental gymnastic thing that happens. You try to convince yourself that it's going to be okay, or you start playing the scenario of odds, or you bargain with God, or you bargain with whatever it is that you think will comfort you in some way, like give you succor to be able to just go on in a rational way. At some point, for me, all that rational thought came to an end, and I realized there's nothing solid to hold on to. There's no grip on reality. And so I was faced with a choice of, do I try to essentially manufacture that for myself? And this will be a little hard to understand, but I was faced with a choice of, I can wake my wife up, inflict all of my anxiety upon her, but I knew that she was not what I needed. She could not help me. Waking her up would only spread the anxiety. She could not provide an answer. It's going to be okay, right? We've had people tell us that and no, you can't say that. It's not true. I don't know that it's going to be okay. She wouldn't have known that it was going to be okay. So instead, I laid there in the dark. It's like the wee hours of the morning, I don't know, 2, 3, 4. And for hours, all I could do was breathe. And even that, barely so. And I would continually was like grasping for what is solid, what is sure. And there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing except the Lord. In that moment, I had an experience where, and I don't mean this to sound strange, I did not hear a voice, I didn't, but I had a sense of the only sure thing was God's presence allowing me to take the next breath and nothing more. And it felt horrible. I mean, just absolutely undoing. Like, I could not have existed for much longer in that. But in those moments, in those hours before the sun came up the next day, for which I was awake the entire time, God's presence was so real that reality has sort of sustained over time to know that there is love underneath the waves, that God does not leave his people, to suffer alone. So very, very instructive for me, just as a man, to come to the end of myself and there's nothing to be proud of. There's no bragging I can do. There's no choice that I made that would make it better. Very instructive to be humble, to realize I am a creature made by, a good maker. To also know that in that moment, the outcome of whether Hayes would be healthy when I woke up in the morning or when we got the next X-ray, if it would be clean, that wasn't the relevant thing. That there was more at play than just this little story, my story, my son's story, who I obviously love very much. My story, his story, is hid in a much larger story. And that gave such immense comfort, not in the same way that, my hammock and a cocktail gives, which I appreciate very much. But it gave like this deep comfort of like, what is really solid and what is really true. And how is that, how would that give me the sense of where I'm ultimately headed, where Hayes is ultimately headed?
That is the most counterintuitive description of comfort that I've ever heard. And of course it has the ring of truth because you were there. And that is nothing that I could possibly say that would be an appropriate response to what you've just shared, other than to say thank you for sharing that, because only you know what that felt like. I'm sure words fail you even as you try to describe what that was like. And just the degree of vulnerability and courage it took to describe that to us, much less to have weathered those moments, those hours in the night. And something that sticks out to me is the courage you demonstrated, the heroism you demonstrated, really, to be willing to not involve Amy Caroline, your sleeping wife, next to you in that moment, and to walk that path for those hours by yourself strikes me as heroic. And you've painted the picture of a man for whom everything has been stripped away. And there are no words other than to say, man, I honor the courage it takes to share that with us. I honor you as a man for walking through those dark hours, and thank you for sharing it. And there's no doubt a gift for someone listening and having heard you share that, and some way that they're going to be able to continue to take steps forward when maybe they thought they couldn't. And so thank you for that gift of courage and vulnerability.
Right on. I do feel like a hero, actually. Of course, I'm kidding, but yeah, when Amy Caroline listens to this, love you, baby.
That's right, totally. Well, you look sort of Clark Kentish with your glasses and everything. That's what I think of as Clark Kent. One of the themes I've hit on in an earlier solo episode is just the fact that our stories and our purposes in life are inseparable. And your story has been written in part with this 7-year chapter of suffering. And I do hope, by the way, and pray that you guys are emerging from this chapter, and that there are some sunnier skies for you guys ahead. And the idea that our story and our purposes are inseparable. And I think some of what I'm getting from what you're sharing is that evaluating the story or trying to reconcile it or create a lot of meaning from it, you hit dead ends. Is that true? That pursuit, that search ends up being a sort of a dead end? And I connect that dot with the other one you mentioned about learning, like in the example of you being in the park with Hayes, to just receive moments as they come to you for what they are, as opposed to what is this about, or why is this happening, or how come this, or how come that, but rather than to try and derive meaning or purpose from the moment, to just receive the moment. Somehow those are connecting to me.
Yeah, I think you hit on something that's really important. Has been for us. One of the things that happens when you're around someone who is sick or someone who is suffering, we don't know how to suffer very well. That's definitely not something that our culture teaches us to do. So consequently, we find ourselves at quite a disadvantage when we are actually suffering. We've not really seen it. We don't talk about it. We try to avoid it. And so what happens when you're the one suffering is people very well-meaning will try to wrap it up in a nice little bow. And there's a couple of things that happen. One is it's going to be okay. It's going to work out. This situation will resolve. Like be positive. Being positive is great, but it does not mean that things are going to work out as you might want them to. The other thing that happens is people try to help assign meaning to things, or they ask you questions, again, well-meaning, what's the significance of having gone through all this stuff? And if I'm honest, our experience has been, I don't know what the purpose is or the meaning in a human sense. I do, however, like thinking about, the earlier thread of realizing that this is an ancient thing. I do know that the purpose of suffering is to produce perseverance and steadfastness, to remind us that we have such great need all the time. We're just like always an eyelash away from catastrophe. We just don't often know it, and we're complicit in helping each other feel like that's not the case. So yeah, that ancient sense that suffering is something that we'll all experience. So, and the meaning beyond that, I think one other thing to add is certainly the meaning beyond that is that God does all things for His glory and our good, and that is super hard to believe. How could something so catastrophic and terrible be for His glory and for our good? And yet that's what the sort of the ancient way would tell us, right? And so again, sort of back to Ecclesiastes, but it's super fascinating as we think about wisdom. And in many ways, your podcast is about wisdom. It's trying to help us understand that we're mortal. There's wisdom in that. And it's actually more of an ancient wisdom than it is a modern wisdom. So an ancient wisdom is trying to help us understand who are we, how are we in relationship to the one who made us? That's the ancient wisdom, if I had to summarize. The modern wisdom is, how do I develop a skill, a talent, or a tool to solve a problem? That's how we think about wisdom. It's very different than who are you. It's what are you and what can you do? That's kind of the modern way of thinking about it. And there's, I think, things to be learned from both the modern and ancient perspective, but would submit that the ancient perspective has endured for a reason, because that is sort of the core fundamental thing. We just happen to live in a time where we have insulation against, and you talk about this, sort of the developed world versus the developing world is even a good example. We have lots of insulation against discomfort.
It's a perspective I hadn't really considered, just the connection that you and your family have with this ancient thread of humanity's struggle to exist on planet Earth in the human form, wrestling with these questions that do seem to be planted in the hearts and minds of men and women throughout the ages, and that get posed to us in these moments of crisis and suffering, and we're forced to deal with them. And you and your family take up your place in the ancient line of people who have had to grapple with these things. And every one of them has come on some level to the ecclesiastical answer, haven't they? And one of the things that I think is that I see from the outside looking in, one of the meanings I derive from hearing your story, even as you say, pursuing meaning in our story doesn't make much sense to you guys. One of the things I get from it is that is your hammock, that as you have been pushed deeper and deeper into these pockets and phases of suffering, you've also learned to become, in a way, almost more material, to enjoy the cocktail and the snacks and the dappled light coming through the tree, and to be almost more present in the physical world, even as much of the physical world around you is like disintegrating. The things, like you described, that dark night of the soul where you're in your bed and nothing feels solid. Even the mattress you're on, like, what can I stake anything on? And you found the answer was nothing other than this, what I picture is like this vibrating sense that there was God underneath of it. There was love beneath the waves. And it's funny because when you described that, it wasn't like your soul was restored and joy, welled up within you. You said, no, it was still freaking 3 or 4 hours of misery. And finally the sun came up and finally your family was awake and you could begin to move on with your day. The comfort you received in that moment was probably not the comfort you were like looking for. Like, I didn't want that. But in all of that, I can picture Matt in his hammock with his cocktail and his snacks and the family knowing he's having Matt time. And you're very much in the present. The dappled light through the trees, the breeze, your cocktail of your choosing, and you're just alive in that moment. I wasn't expecting to find that in your story. But I think that's part of what I'm taking away from this is that to the degree that I can replicate what you've learned, and I can only replicate it to a degree because I have to go through what you've gone through to really know what life looks like for you now. But, the next time I'm on porch with one of my boys, I'm going to be a little more aware of the breeze on my face. And for some reason, I've been really aware lately of just like when I'm snuggling with my boys before I go to bed and I'm messing with their hair or something, I've got this warm breathing creation next to me who's drawing breath in and pushing breath out, and I'm doing the same thing next to him. And so for me, it amplifies that sense of awareness because my predisposition is in those moments of goodness with my son to go, oh, when's it going to go away? When's the other shoe going to drop? And I'm going to double down on just being like, screw that, Petty. You're here with a warm breathing creation who's in your family and who you love deeply. Just be here. And in a flipping of the script of your dark night of the soul, just breathe. Don't try to derive meaning. Don't try to project into the future. Don't try to look back on the past, and just breathe with your son right now.
That's the good stuff. It gives me such joy to hear you kind of talk about how that works itself out for you, your relationship with your kids, the physical interaction that you have. Yeah, I mean, that's the good stuff, right? Here's the trick though, or perhaps the pitfall to be avoided. And this is part of the message of Ecclesiastes is do not try to appropriate that gift, right? So those wonderful warm moments for yourself and to make them last beyond what they are intended, right? So that's when we think about, you're worried about the shoe dropping. It's a form of that, right? Where, I love this so much. I love this more than anything else, right?
Don't artificially resuscitate or prolong its life. Let it be however long it is and then move on. Right.
And have a claim that it must always be this way. My child, for me, right, like part of our experience, my child must always be healthy. Hayes would fall and scrape his knee. He was like a little daredevil, like most little boys probably. He split his chin open, 3 times in the same place, right? So they got to know us at KidMed pretty well. I used to have as I'm putting, some antibiotic ointment on his chin and a Band-Aid over his stitches, that I'm doing this, I'm bandaging him up and he's going to grow up. And then when, the crap hit the fan with Hayes, I realized I never should have had that thought. And I understand why I did. And, because most kids grow up and most kids don't have bone cancer. And how could I know? At the same time, it's super instructive. Don't think that this should last. It does not last. Don't try to appropriate God's good gifts in the form of these moments for yourself and then have the expectation that they must exist. Because if you do, I'm speaking to myself, if I do, then I have an expectation that is unrealistic, is out of balance with the created order. It will not endure. And so then I will suffer, have an unrealistic view of what should happen, and be bitter, be angry. It's all wrong. It's all foul, that we're not intended, this side of heaven to experience it that way.
So this tips me off to sort of a parallel conversation that doesn't directly relate to this, but you're talking about, developing a healthy sense of of detachment from outcomes and from demanding a certain result. And all of the ancient traditions, whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, I'm not super well read on all these things, but it seems there's a thread of that in most all of them, that even as we enjoy and imbibe the things of life, and then we go through the sufferings of life and all these things, to remain unattached to any specific outcome, or to successfully keep from demanding a certain outcome, is one of the bits of wisdom for navigating life as a human being on planet Earth that transcends faith. It transcends philosophies. It is a foundational piece in the human condition. And if we can continue to learn to, as you said, take the moments as they come, enjoy what the moment brings us, and then release that moment when the moment goes without grasping for it and holding on to it. And That's what we're really good at doing in the Western developed quote unquote world. And I say quote unquote simply because I don't think all the ways that we've developed in the Western world have served us served us all that well. So that's why I do the whole quote thing. But is we're really good at demanding that certain things be a certain way into perpetuity. And when it doesn't happen, like you said earlier, we're unequipped. You know, we're especially unequipped in the convenient lives that we live to deal with this crisis that's occurred, when in fact that crisis has always been right beneath the surface. It's always been a fact of life for humanity. But when it shows up, we go, what is happening here? And how can we get rid of that as soon as possible? It just strikes me that as you say that, and you come from a Christian perspective, that a Buddhist could say the same thing. And that's because we all share the same mortal coil. We share the same challenges of living on planet Earth. We ask the same questions, we search for the same things, and some of the same answers keep popping up in this vein of wisdom that I think you're helping us tap into. And that's a word that I want to kind of put over this whole episode. And your story is just this wisdom piece that, man, you've given us a lot of wisdom that's been hard won for you and your family, that hopefully those of us listening won't have to, go and experience for ourselves in the same way. But even if some of us do, and guess what? Some of us, and it could be me, it could be you within earshot of this episode, will have suffering equal to, if not greater than, what Matt and his family has gone through. And I hope if that day comes for you, that Matt's story and his message and the wisdom that he's bringing to us will ring in your ears and help you to navigate it and to come out the other side, so to speak, having gleaned some more of the wisdom that Matt's sharing with us. Matt, let's stop there. I don't feel adequate to the task of being the steward of this story, and there's so much more that we could talk about. And I just have so much curiosity about, things like, how did you keep going? How did you first feel when you got the diagnosis? How did you and Amy Caroline navigate just the hardships of taking care of a child who was mortally sick, and keep food on the table, and keep going to do a job? By the way, you have a job with a ton of responsibility, a lot of people depending upon you. I mean, Hayes's condition was not the only thing going on in your life. You have two daughters who also needed tending and care, and I'm so curious about. And maybe we'll have to have another conversation because there's just so many threads to this story.
Yeah, I do. I know we're coming up on the end of our time. I do feel compelled to say this is some of the sweetest time of my life, which I don't know what that sounds like after listening to the story. And AC and I still talk about it that way. It was so raw, and we would not choose to go back and do it over again. But it's the intimacy between us and the maker is just so sweet. And the people that I work with, I felt so cared for and supported. So I was typically the guy, I'm supposed to have a vision, supposed to chart a course, have the energy, so humbling to, be working out of a hospital room, sitting on a little cot and feeling so tired and so out of ideas, and trying to think about providing healthcare for people in Richmond from New York City. So I felt so humbled and cared for by the people that I work with. There was just such a generous group of people that cared for me professionally, and such a great community at our church as well to meet so many of our physical and emotional and spiritual needs. So I almost can't believe that I'm saying this, but I feel very fortunate. Yeah, I don't know another way to say it. God is good, man.
There's that thing that everyone who has experienced intense suffering ultimately says. They say that, and we have to believe that you mean that because you've been the one living it. And so, what is it about suffering that leads those who've experienced it to say that? There's got to be something there. And so I would just add that for our listeners and say, when suffering shows up, don't instinctively resist it and try to make it stop and go away. To Matt's point, receive it as the moment that's there, and you'll go through all the human things, of course, that we go through in the face of suffering, but because there is something to be gained. I want you, will you land the plane for us, Matt, on two questions? One is, you said earlier before we got to recording, knowing that you're dying isn't enough. And of course, this podcast is about helping us all to wake up to the fact that we are going to die. And so what are you doing today to make the most of the life that you've been given? And you said, knowing that you're dying isn't enough. And so will you say more about what that means, and then like what needs to be added to it for it to be a fuller representation of reality? And the final thing would be, is there anything else that you would wish to bottle? These are two questions that you would wish to bottle for us from your story and hope that each of us could like implant in our hearts and our minds and use moving forward. So take the first one, knowing I'm dying isn't enough. So what do you mean by that? And what else do we need?
So knowing that we're dying is a good start. It's good to know that we're mortal. We don't have unlimited time. I think it prompts some appropriate soul searching and at least gets us out of the sort of collective deception of the world that this life can be managed. I will be the first human to successfully manage life. That's not the case. But I think that question by itself, or that realization, is not enough. It, for me, prompts me to think, who am I? And that question is inextricably tied to who made me. That question, it for me boils down, since you asked me to come on and do a podcast, as I've thought about these concepts sort of generally, continually turn back all the way to, it's a question of identity. I think that's the primary question in my life, is who am I? And the corollary, who made me? So I'll just leave it at that. I think, probably everyone needs to interact with that a bit differently. And I certainly would not want to presume to try to answer that question for anybody else. For me, that's where my heart and mind are almost all the time, particularly as I think about, and it's a pleasure to be on with you to tell the story as well. Again, I don't think there's anything special about it, but it is in some way therapeutic. I think this is only the third time that I've really told the whole story from beginning to end. So
what I'm hearing is that when you know that you're dying, it then, you know that you're going to die, it begs some other questions. And the ones that you've mentioned, who am I and where did I come from, are two of the critical ones. And of course, coincidentally enough, providentially, whatever, Rob Rigg has posed the same questions on the episode prior to this one. So there must be something here around not just understanding that we're dying, because you can know that you're dying, but still be at a loss as to how then to live. Okay, yeah, I see that. I am going to die, but then what does that mean for how I live? And that's what I think the other questions you're posing come in. You can say, well, what do I believe this life is for? What is a human made for? What am I as a unique human made for? And then a whole other set of questions come up once you've been willing to accept I am going to die, the time is limited, and then you start wondering what to do with it.
That's right. I think that's exactly right. One of your last episodes was, if you knew you were going to die in 5 years, which I think is a really instructive question, right? If you knew you were going to die in 5 years, what would you do today? So you still have some time left, but what do you do? I think that depends on who do you think you are, and who do you think made you, or how do you interact with that sort of question. And that can get a little metaphysical and weird maybe, but it really does boil down to identity and how does that propel me out into the world. And so to answer your second question, what would I bottle? I hesitate really to say, because again, there's power in everyone's story. What I would say is my story is hid in a much larger story. That's a super helpful realization, to think that I have this immense privilege to be able to have these moments, to be useful for people in really some unexpected ways, right? So my story, all the interactions we've had, things that I would not ascribe any meaning to, are often, come to find out, years later, were like super meaningful. Like the story that I told about Brian, I think if he were still with us, or maybe even Holly now, may or may not say, oh, that was a really significant thing in our lives. I mean, that was the Lord providing for us, in the midst of immense loneliness in a huge city, and on the eve of a really big surgery, just this kindness that it was them, but their story was hid in a larger story. That was the Lord loving us and loving them. To see that it's this difference between rich life and poor life, which maybe is a whole other podcast. But
I love that. That makes me super curious.
You can live a life with a variety of circumstances, and it can be a rich life or a poor life. And I don't think that is simply the choices that I make to interpret the situation. That is a question for me of identity and this bigness of the story. If I do not belong to myself, but belong body and soul to my faithful Savior and wrapped up in that big story, that changes the trajectory of my life. It gives me immense freedom and comfort, not in the cheap comfort hammock way, as good as that is, but in the really deep soul, risk-taking, enduring, good for people in ways that you can't possibly imagine way. Super, super cool, right? So your story is hid in a much larger story, and man, is that wonderful.
Yeah, what a wonderful sense of belonging. Yeah, I love that.
I love that word. Yeah.
Rich life, poor life. Yeah, that is a whole episode, and you're gonna have to come on and host that one, okay? I can tell that this conversation is going to be working in my conscious and my subconscious for many days to come. That you have planted a way of thinking and a perspective and things in my heart and mind that I'm going to be digesting for a while. So thank you, Matt. You've taken time out of your workday with a lot of responsibilities in the middle of a family that still is dealing with some stuff, and you've got stuff going on. Thank you for taking time. It really is an act of service and a labor of love on your part to spend time with me, and then for us to be able to share this with the listeners. Thank you, and love you, man, and I appreciate you being here. All the best. Let's stay in touch. And for all those of you listening, as Matt has helped us to remember, we are going to die, but we're not dead yet. And so get after it.
Thanks, Andrew. See you, brother.
Matt, see you, man. There's love beneath the waves. The magical moments in a hammock as dappled sunlight hits your skin, a light breeze washes over you, and a good book entertains you. Receiving every moment for what it is, nothing less, nothing more. Our stories are hidden within a much larger story. These are some of the things that stick with me from Matt's story. These are some of the nuggets of ancient wisdom that bubble up for me from this modern-day tale. What about you? What hit home with you from Matt's story? How can you convert that takeaway into something that makes a real-world difference in your life? Here's a little heat to get you in the game with even more guts, gusto, and abandon. What if you knew with 100% certainty that you only had 5 years to live? What would you do differently starting today? My purpose as a coach is to help you live the life you know you were made to live. Connect with me on Facebook at Andrew Petty Coach or email me at andrew@digdeepwinbig.com to learn more about Graveyard Group Masterminds, where we make time each week to invest in your life's most important work. Visit digdeepwinbig.com/The Graveyard Group. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.